All right, folks, good morning. Welcome back to the Data Management for Linguistics Workshop, Day 2. Very exciting stuff today. Thank you all, for those of you who were here yesterday, for your enthusiasm and patience. It was I thought it was great. I really loved working with all of you. Today we're going to continue with a couple of short lecture sessions before lunch, and with interwoven work times, just like yesterday. And then we'll have a lunch break. And then after lunch will be a writing session. So for those of you who are really wanting to work on your DMP, please stay, write, work. We'll do peer review. We're going to be here to help you. We'll be here to continue the discussion, ask any questions that you might have. But I know many of you want to do the poster session, so that's totally fine. Please feel free to go to that. We might sneak out and go to it too. So if you don't want to stay after lunch, that's totally fine. We will have a little survey for you to take to evaluate this workshop, because this is the first time we've given this workshop, so your feedback will be very helpful. And we're also planning to give future versions of this workshop. So if you have any thoughts about what was particularly useful or something you would like to know more about, please let us know so that we can make it better for the next time, next crowd of folks that take this. I think you'll be receiving, we'll have a link to that, and you'll probably be receiving it by email, so please be on the lookout for that. All right, we have coffee back here still with cream and sugar. I keep saying that, but it's really important. It's Sunday morning, and for those of you who didn't hear, there's still a few little swag items on the tables. Please feel free to take them, even if you already took one, because I'm not taking them back home. Okay, so today we're going to start with our 6th info session, which is on selection, preservation, and sharing. And I want to start with the best general advice that I think I can ever give you, and that is that librarians and repository staff are perhaps your best allies in this. We can help. So find your friendly librarian. And to wake you all up, I thought I would start with a hilarious video from our friends at the Tromsø Repository of Language and Linguistics to just illustrate why having a friendly librarian around is good for you, and to talk a little bit about what their repository can do for you. So here we go. Here we go.
Linguists are increasingly reporting on datasets and statistical analyses in their articles. But what happens to the data and code after the articles are published? And what if someone wants to access that data?
Yeah?
Hi, I'm Scotty, junior linguist, and I'm writing a dissertation on nominalization in Klingon. I read your article with the logistic regression analysis of Quenya, and I really thought it'd be great to compare your data with mine, and I wondered if I could get a copy of your data and code.
That study was done several years ago. Let me go take a look.
Okay, thanks.
Nominalization. Quenya. What year was that?
Keeping your data files on a local computer or server is a bit like keeping your money under your mattress.
Transitivity? No. Adjectives? No. Conjunctions? No. Ethical data? Definitely not ethical. Palgalization? No. Reduplication? No. Stress on borrowed nouns? Definitely lots of stress. Ah! This might be it, but I can't really read this one anymore. And where's the code for the logistic regression? Oh, shit. Listen, I think I need some more time to locate that data and code.
Locate it? You mean you don't have it? Is it lost?
No, it's not lost. I just need to organize it, make sure it's readable, you know.
Okay, but it's kind of a famous study, and I really need it for my dissertation.
Well, I'll do my best, but I can't promise anything.
Promise anything? You can't promise anything? It was funded by the Hypercorrect Linguistic Science Foundation. Doesn't that mean you're supposed to share the data?
Just give me a little more time, like a few weeks.
Weeks? I can't wait that long. What about my dissertation? No.
Don't call me.
Wait.
I'll call you.
No.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How can I help you?
I'm Scotty, junior linguist, and I'm doing my dissertation on nominalization in Klingon. I was wondering if you had any data sets that were similar to mine that I could use in a logistic regression analysis.
Okay, let's see. So now I have you logged into trolling, and we have nominalization, we have nouns, we have logistic regression. Do you have any other keywords?
Yeah, how about constructed languages?
Okay. Yeah, you hit the jackpot. We actually had 22 studies that match your query.
Fantastic. Can I have them now?
Just wait a second to beam them up, Scotty. So here you go.
Oh, now that is substantive. I'll be able to get my dissertation started and maybe even get some articles written on the side. Thank you.
Just before you go, when you're ready to submit your own dissertation, remember to come back to trolling and deposit your own data, because that's the best way to get a return on your own investment.
Oh, I'll be back. You betcha. Thank you.
Bye.
Trolling is a bank where everyone gets richer. And who knows, maybe you can even earn interest. That is, in your research. Find trolling at opendata.uit.no.
Did you just say you don't understand what that was? Yeah. Trolling is a repository for linguistics data. That was our friend Helena, who was there at the end. And you could tell she was barely keeping a straight face, which is really funny. She is fantastic. She works with our group on data citation, and trolling is a real thing. It's the Tromsø repository of language and linguistics. They're great people, and that's a great place to put your data when you're done with it. So we're going to talk about that today. And therefore, junior linguists like Scotty there in that video can find your data, maybe reuse it, cite you, do all kinds of good stuff. So don't play it again. I'm not interested in playing it. There we go. Okay, so this lesson looks at preservation of research data at the end of a research project, but that doesn't mean you should wait until then to make your plan. That's why we're putting it in your plan now. So this would be the time when you are preparing your data for future reuse, preserving it, archiving it, making your notes about it so that you don't forget, like, what did that metadata field mean again? What did this file structure, what was this file name? So you can put all that stuff together. And then we'll go over how to find a great place to preserve and archive your data, give you some examples to explore, and that'll be your work session for today. We'll be exploring the places to house your data. One of those could be, in fact, trolling. I love that name. Another one might be Isla. Yes, we'll get to that. Okay, we're also going to cover the sharing of research data. So that's at the end in the publication phase. So when you publish your articles that use that data, you can cite your data set, and people will be able to find your data set and then perhaps reuse those data for future projects or contact you if they're a junior linguist who wants to use them in your dissertation. Okay, so let's start with selection. So which of your data should be retained, shared, and preserved? I am not the person who's going to tell you this data set, and this data set, but I'm going to give you some guidelines on how to think about this. So here are the questions to frame your thinking around how to select what of your data you should preserve. So the first question, and you know this is going to come from me because we talked all about legal stuff the other day, legal and ethical stuff yesterday. Do you need to retain or destroy any of your data due to contractual or ethical obligations? So did you promise to keep your data for 7 years, for example? So then you need to keep it for 7 years. Did you promise to destroy any sensitive identifying information after you collected the data? You need to destroy it, and you need to figure out how you're going to destroy it in a way where it is destroyed permanently, or make sure that it can't be traced back to your original data set. If you're working with a community, how does your community want the data to be shared? We talked a little bit about talking with your community about the project that you're doing and figuring out what could they use it for something that they're doing in their community? Could it be used by a cultural center or a museum? Could it be used by students who are learning about the language? Could your data be helpful in a broader sense? Or is your community sensitive about it, doesn't want that information to get out? How do you respect that? These are all things you should think about when it comes to selection of your data. And finally, how might other scholars reuse your data? What might be useful to other people that you know now or that you may know in the future? How might a junior linguist be able to use your logistic regression in the future?
That thing about destroying data makes me uncomfortable, and there's a whole arrangement, certainly in medical research, where rather than destroying data to prevent people, subjects and so forth, being identified, to anonymize, you replace names with codes, so forth and so on. So that
Right, but then what do you do with those original names?
Okay, in principle you have to destroy them, but that destroying the old stuff while the new stuff is preserved in a useful fashion is important.
Exactly.
I think that's worth it, and I'm pretty sure that most places that you would be getting funding from would have provision for that.
Absolutely. Exactly. So if you do have to destroy some identifying information, how do you do that in a way that keeps your data useful for the future? Okay. So we talked. Oh.
The point here is that that needs to go in your data management plan.
Yes.
Like whatever IRB agreement was made between you and your university, or between you and the requirements of the funding agency, that needs to be stated in the data management plan. There shouldn't be anything ambiguous, like, is this data going to be destroyed? Does it have to be? If it's got to be anonymized, you put that in the data management plan. You say that. If it's got to be destroyed, you have to say that in your data management plan.
Yeah, so you make a plan for it. And whatever your plan is, set it out early so you know what you're going to do. So when the time comes, you're not like, okay, so now I need to figure out how to do this. Okay. I mentioned envisioning how the data may be reused by you and others, and this can help you in your selection process. So what kinds of things might be done with your data? For example, you could, people might want to use your data to validate or replicate research findings from your study. Maybe 20 years in the future, they might say, has this changed at all? They collect some new data, they redo your study, and then compare it to their new data, for example. Students might want to rerun your process to learn how to do it. If you have all the information there, that might be something that could be possible. It could be an educational material. Folks might want to conduct new studies using your same data in the same or even totally different fields. For example, they might be able to build a corpus out of interviews that you've done, or another kind of resource. And I've already mentioned teaching materials, but there are so many teaching materials that can be made out of data, not just for learning how to work with data for students who are starting out this process, but also to illustrate other phenomena from your data set. So try to be a little creative and try to think about the future of your data set when you're trying to select what you're going to save out of it. And it's also a little bit inspiring and can inspire you to work on future projects as well. But as you're writing your data management plan, you can put some of these things in there to say, look, my data can be reused in all these different ways. It has great value. Give me some money. Not to put too fine a point on it. And when you're thinking about that reuse, don't just think about linguists like you, but other disciplines. And this is important not just for the benefits, but maybe also some drawbacks. So, for example, could a syntactician find examples of a linguistic phenomenon in your language documentation data? So maybe you should include the full sentence structure, not just a word list. Might be interesting. Would you be collecting narratives? That could be a source for sociolinguists to do discourse analysis. Could phoneticians use your sound recordings? We were talking about sound recording quality yesterday a little bit. Maybe that wouldn't work for everybody, but maybe it could. If you have really good recordings, maybe preserve them so that they could be used in this way. If you're collecting information, this is where it gets tricky, about local wildlife or plants. Would a botanist be interested in that? Maybe a zoologist or a biologist or a pharmacist? This is where it could be harmful. There's been a lot of talk about pharmaceutical companies, medical researchers using cultural knowledge about healing in ways where they profit and the community doesn't. We talked a little bit about this with the ethics lecture yesterday about this preservation of traditional knowledge. I have in the notes for this slide a citation for a legal document on this that gives you some, if this does apply to you or if you're just interested, it talks about some legal frameworks for thinking about this question about if it could be harmful and what can we do about it. Obviously, though, I know you can't envision all possibilities, but if you just start to think about it, and in thinking about and planning for preservation and sharing, more possibilities will open up, not just for other people, but also for you in the future. You could tell I'm kind of a data sharing advocate here. Okay, now let's talk about the actual preservation. Once you've selected the data that you want to save, you need to find out how to preserve it. Archives and repositories are the way to do this. We've heard this yesterday from the experts here. It's not just backing up your data on hard drives, putting them in a drawer, and then relying on you, a human who's fallible and terrible things could happen. Ants could get into your hard drive, who knows what could happen. That's not a good enough preservation tactic. Archives and repositories are run by dedicated staff, like Susan, like myself, and we have training in preservation, we have the infrastructure, we have the servers. These archives are usually found in university libraries or run by research groups. And depending on your field, a digital language archive, which is primarily suited for language documentation materials, it has metadata specific to that, may also fit some sociolinguistics studies, maybe not like neurolinguistic studies for a digital language archive. That might be appropriate. There's also linguistics data repositories like trolling, which may be more appropriate for different fields, or a general data repository for all kinds of different fields might be helpful for you. There's also this thing called an institutional repository. We were talking about that at UMass Amherst yesterday. Institutional repositories are for the output of an institution. Like I run the repository for the University of Pittsburgh. Everybody from Pitt can put all their stuff in there, no matter what it is, conference papers, data sets, posters, dissertations, whatever. But oftentimes these have limited capacity for data. So you might want to check with your friendly librarian, like Helena, like myself, to see about that possibility. Okay. Some advice for thinking about archiving data for your data management plan. Repository staff will not process your data for you. I put this meme in there just for you, Susan. So you can't just drop off a bunch of cassette tapes and think that somebody is going to have the time to process that, add metadata. You are the expert on your data. You need to document it using some of the advice that we've given you. We really rely on you to tell us what your data are so that we can share that with others. We make that sharing possible, give you the infrastructure, but we need your expertise ahead of time. So build in time and resources into your DMP. Don't be afraid to ask for money for extra staff, to hire somebody to help you document this stuff and preserve it. Don't be afraid to ask for that extra time. That's the perfect thing to put into a data management plan, especially if you justify it. Because if you say, I want to make a really great data set that can be used for teaching data science to linguists for years to come, I need to hire a student to help me document it as I go along, here's the money. Then you have a justification for there and you have some extra resources. Find out ahead of time the file and metadata requirements for your intended repository and attempt to integrate that as you go along, as you work with the data. So if you have a particular metadata standard that Susan was talking about yesterday that you're going to be working with for this repository, then you can learn about that at the outset, and then as you start saving your own files and backing them up and storing them, you can start incorporating those standards so that you have a little less work to do right there at the end. You already have it going. And ask repository staff for any documentations or guides that they might have early. Don't wait for the end, because those guides can help you at the outset. We had a linguist do her dissertation, and she had a whole bunch of data, and she wanted to share it. And she came to us right after she defended her dissertation, and she said, I want to share my dissertation data. How do I do that? And she only had 3 weeks before she graduated and her access to the repository through her computing account would expire. So she had to do a ton of work in 3 weeks after her defense, when really all she wanted to do was like party and you know, get ready for her graduation. So ask early, don't be afraid. I don't want to speak for Susan, but I know if somebody asked me way ahead of time, I would be happy to help them. In fact, I'd be excited that somebody was on the ball so early. She's nodding, yes. Yes, we would be delighted to hear from you early. All right. Little advice about sharing. So sharing and open access, open data is my primary field where I work. So I am obviously an advocate for sharing data, but I understand that there are some times when you just can't. It's not ethical, it's not legal, it's not possible. So the advice that I like to give is to be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. What does that mean? Well, think about the benefits of sharing. So data sharing helps to preserve the health of our field. So it helps with the replication of scholarly work. Have you heard about the reproducibility crisis in psychology that they're having, where all their study, like a whole bunch of their very famous studies, suddenly nobody's really sure if they're valid because they can't reproduce the findings, either because they don't have the data sets or they do have partial data sets, and then the statistics or the experiments they run don't turn out right the same way they're reported in the paper. So now a whole bunch of work is having to be redone, and foundational ideas in that field are being questioned because they're just not sure if the data match the findings. So you, by sharing your data, can help with the health of the field through that. Say, look, here's the proof. Please test it. Please tell me if you find something else. Be open to that. It's not criticism of you. It's collaboration, right? That's try to reframe your thinking. I know for me, at least, I get like nervous when I think somebody's going to question my findings. Like, oh, they're going to expose me for the fraud that I am, right? But that's reframing that thought to say, I have done my first pass on this, and other people have different ways of viewing things that can only make it richer. That's a great way to reframe your thinking on that. Also, you can help with the advancement of new studies without the need to collect new data. So if somebody else wants to do a study on the language that you have spent 3 years studying, and they won't have to go and recollect all of those word lists, they won't have to spend their time, they can do something more advanced and use your word list as a foundation for their future studies. That can help advance the field in that way. And that might lead to collaboration. You might suddenly have a collaborator, a cool new project to work on. It certainly leads to a lot of citations for your work. You can get citations to your data set. You can publish a paper about your data set, talking about it, and get citations for that. Looks great on your tenure portfolio or your job application. This can also help with cross-disciplinary work, because you never know who's going to be interested. So this happened to me directly. I collected some interesting videos and data, which, as you learned yesterday, I can't actually share publicly, but I was talking about them at a conference, and this economist happened to see my slides that I had shared openly with some of the videos and some of the data that I had shared, and he said, I think that is a great expression of game theory in this online game. Can I work with you on a project to talk about game theory and decision making and the language used about it in this online game? And I said, yeah, of course. So we did this paper together, and it was all because I happened to post my slides that had some data in it. So imagine if you posted your data sets for your paper. This too could happen to you. Awesome. And also for your community, for those of you who are working in a community, you can create accessible cultural and historical resources for the community that may be helpful, as we talked about, for that community to do their own work, their own projects, to build their own resources, and use your material as a foundation for that. Yes?
This reminds me of something that also relates to the cross-disciplinary thing, I think.
Yeah.
That I wanted to ask you. As a sociolinguist and discourse analyst, I'm really interested in oral history data.
Yes.
But I don't know how to go about finding out about it.
Let's talk at the break. Okay. Some questions to share, or questions to think about. Oh, sorry.
Go back to about there are places where you need to be absolutely paranoid about if you're working with a minority community that might have something of value.
Yes.
Something of value might be an archaeological site that could be looted. It might be the possibility of deposit of oil.
Right.
It might be any number of things which, if it gets exposed to some bad guys out there, they could come and do terrible harm. So you really need to think about beyond the linguistic to the whole.
Yes,
what
exactly.
might make people vulnerable aspect.
We did actually cover that.
Oh, okay. Good.
And I wanted to say, there's a great example of an I just discovered this before I left work on Thursday to come to this. There's a great example of an archaeologist who has made all of his analyses, all of his data, his papers. He's done open science on this archaeological field site. But he hasn't released his data with the GIS coordinates, with all the identifying information, because of this very thing, because the community that he was working with was worried about people coming in and looting it. It was apparently a very religious, significant site. But he was able to release the numbers that he had been running and very thoughtfully release all of his methodology for it so that this methodology and this process could be replicated elsewhere, but not the data itself. So this is, again, if you have something like this where it's very sensitive, there may be parts of your data or parts of analyses that you run that you can share to help the field, to help with replication, to help with people learning how to do these kinds of studies without releasing this very sensitive data. Again, as we said yesterday, just because it's legal or possible doesn't mean it's ethical. So always keep that in your mind. Here are some questions to consider. Again, are there ethical or legal restrictions on what you can share? We talked about that yesterday. Here was another good example of some of the things that might come up. Are there sensitive data? Are they anonymized properly? Have you made a plan for that? What is your plan? How will you license your data? And by license, I mean reuse rights. So we talked about copyright yesterday a little bit. If you have data that are subject to copyright, so you own them, how can you license them so that other people can reuse them in a way that's helpful? So we talked over here about Creative Commons licenses yesterday, a little bit in the question session. These are ways to say, yes, I own this, please attribute me for this, but also please reuse it. You can say, please reuse it however you want. Please reuse it, but don't sell it. Please reuse it, but don't change it. Okay, that'd be weird for a data set, but there are these options for how to license your data if it's possible. And where will you share your data? What repository will it go in? Will you put it in multiple places? Will you be sharing it completely openly? Will you put different pieces of it different places? Will you need any access restrictions for these privacy or ethics questions? Can your data set be open? There's a decision tree about this, which I have linked here about, we saw it yesterday a little bit, about how to decide if your data set can be open. And then finally, how will you track the use of your data set? Does your repository have any metrics for numbers of downloads? Are you going to be able to ask people to email you if they use your data set? Will you be able to see if people are citing it? You can ask your librarian or your archivist for if they have any ways to do that in your repository, or you can use some tools of your own. And if you're interested in that, I can talk a lot about that because that's like the other part of my field. Okay. I have now given you some framing questions, some things to think about, and now I want you to do a little investigation in this work session. And we're going to be around to help you with this. We have about 25 minutes, if I see 9:35 is correct on that screen there. The next couple of slides so these are the questions. So I want you to find a place which would be appropriate for your data. And the next couple of slides, I have some examples, some links to places, to these repositories. I have a link to Trolling, I have a link to Isla, I have a link to the Delamon archives, a whole bunch of other ones. And I'll give you a little short introduction to those. But we want to think about, what is the repository? Why is it appropriate for your data? If you can find any instructions for how to archive, metadata standards, or other considerations. Maybe they have a file size limit that you're going to need to pay attention to that you might be able to find on their instructions pages. Are there any costs to archiving in this repository, or is it free? Are you going to need to hire somebody to help you with your data? Like, kind of try to start thinking about that a little bit for your data management plan. These are the types of repositories that I've included on here. This slide is digital language archives or dedicated digital language archive, DLA.
The top is digital.
Okay, the top is digital language repositories. There's several here. There are some more. There are institutional repositories that have language collections, which may be open to others, or maybe just be open to people at their institution. There's physical archives with some digital collections. And next slide has different kinds of archives. So there's subject-specific data repositories. So here's the Tromsø repository of language and linguistics, trolling, which takes all kinds of linguistic data, neurolinguistic, sociolinguistic, all kinds of stuff. There's a linguistics data consortium, which I think we were talking about over here a little bit yesterday, a couple other examples. And then there are subject agnostic data repositories. So Dryad and Figshare are examples of those, where you can share your data and it'll be housed alongside data from all kinds of other disciplines, which is pretty neat. I kind of like that. I like to look at what other institutions other fields are sharing, what kind of cool data is in there. And then institutional repository. I would suggest that you find out if your institution has an institutional repository anyway, because that will be useful for you for your conference papers, for your preprints, for your posters, etc. You should find out if you have one and start using it. Plug from the institutional repository librarian here. You could go to your library's website and search for a repository or archive there. It may or may not be suited to data. It might be something you can find out there. But maybe one of these other kinds of repositories would be useful for you. Would the archivist have any additional things to add before we go into the work session?
Just that, did you mention that NSF requires a letter from an archive?
Ah, great.
Yeah, so if you're applying for a Dell grant from NSF, the Documenting Endangered Languages, they actually require 2 extra documents. They require a letter of support from an archive, which basically ensures that you get in touch with one of us early, right? And they also require a statement of consultation, which ensures that you've consulted with the community, that you have permission to do the work there. So those are 2 important documents.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, I don't know if you mentioned Delamon. Yeah, and that you can get in touch with anybody Delamon and we'll help you find the right archive.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got 2 Delamon past presidents here, so, and current president, past and current. So if you have questions about Delamon, now is the time.
Also, I will plug that NSF and NEH will allow you to put money for the archive into your budget, and we encourage you to do so, because especially if you have videos, they're really, really expensive to store. All libraries and archives are extremely underfunded. Most libraries in the US have been on flat budgets for the last 10 years. And as digital data collecting becomes the norm, the digital preservation and storage load placed on the archives becomes more and more burdensome. So you are allowed to put up to 8% of your direct costs minus salaries into your budget for the archive. So please talk to the archivist. Some archives are set up to be able to handle this right away. Other archives might be hearing about it for the first time. But one of the things that the Delamon organization did was negotiate this amount with NSF. And so this is agreed upon by NSF. NEH is another matter, but they tend, if we're talking about the DEL grant, Documenting Endangered Languages, that grant is co-sponsored by NSF and NEH. And so anyone who, at NEH, who looks at linguistic projects, and especially language documentation projects, is aware of this 8% number. Yeah. But then some of the archives also have very specific costing models. So if the 8% is too astronomical, as long as you've done a very detailed data management plan, the archivist can look at the data management plan with you and help you come to a very specific amount to put in the grant proposal. Yeah. Yes, Kate?
Why don't you send the information out to Tromsø instead of a place in the U.S.?
Because Tromsø is data repository, it doesn't take language documentation. And many of the language documentation archives don't want data sets. Does that make sense?
Let me essentially, it serves other subfields besides language documentation. So language documentation has been at the forefront in linguistics of developing archiving procedures. And so this TRUMSO will actually extend the ability to archive data sets to the rest of linguistics. Right. Most of the endangered language archives have very specific metadata for endangered languages, but if you're doing other kinds of linguistics, there's no really good place to put it. That's partially because there hasn't been an accepted practice across linguistics for doing anything with your data until, I mean, there still is no real standard. Things are very slowly changing. But with places like TRUMSO and trolling, you can, other kinds of linguistics practitioners can start to archive data sets.
And I'll say TRUMSO. TRUMSO is part of the Harvard Dataverse as well. So Harvard has what's called a Dataverse, which is an infrastructure to archive data sets and do this locks, lots of copies, keep stuff safe and share them, and lots of metadata. And Harvard and trolling uses their infrastructure for that, which is pretty cool. An example of a data set in trolling that might be thinking about this, there's a phonetic study in there where there's like vowel measurements, formants, plots, etc., which might not be appropriate for a language archive. Lots of more quantitative linguistic data are in there. You could go there and actually just look at the data sets. They're all open and free, so you can see what kinds of stuff they have on there already. Also a great resource if you're like junior linguist Scotty and you're wanting to see what kind of data might be out there that you could work with to do a project. You can just kind of browse. It's pretty neat.
Trolling is also smaller, and it can potentially smaller in scope. Right. In this class, we've been talking about data management plans for grants. So we're all thinking about larger data sets for larger research projects. But repositories like trolling will take smaller sets, for example, just the data that goes with an article that we wrote and published. Right. So they have a different scope as well. So much more useful.
I definitely recommend taking a couple minutes, just checking it out, seeing what they have. It's really neat just to see what kind of cool stuff people are creating. Yes.
So I was talking to another participant here who is from the University of Hong Kong. She was actually told that she needs to keep all the data herself rather than putting in a repository. Does that make any sense? Is that something?
Who told her that?
The university.
Well,
that's a cultural difference.
Yeah, that's a cultural difference.
if you're at a university, you have to do what your university tells you to do with the data.
Yeah.
And we talked about that yesterday, that many, even professors who work at particular universities cannot publish data sets or information without their university's permission first. Or other universities would consider those data sets created by the professors to be their property and not the professor's property.
Mm-hmm.
And so the university dictates what happens to the data set.
Right. Question?
On the other hand, sometimes you just don't need to talk to them.
Right.
Yeah, they don't have to know everything.
Yeah.
In the world of programmers, there is one place in particular called GitHub,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
where people are in the habit of storing their source, programming source for whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But people do also store data there, and a friend of mine has stored linguistic stuff there. And,
Oh, interesting.
The advantage is that it's totally open-ended, and of course the disadvantage is that it's totally open-ended.
Right.
You can do a lot of things in GitHub. We do project management in GitHub sometimes, so that's fun. Yeah.
A technical issue relative to mechanical Turk, which I'm sure has gotten mentioned.
It hasn't been mentioned here yet, no.
Really?
Really? Yes. it was
Seriously?
Here, but, right. We haven't mentioned mechanical Turk.
Okay. Well, with respect to anonymizing data, as I understand their methods, okay, the anonymization process is sort of built in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I see codes for workers, et cetera, and for particular tasks that they do. And as far as I can tell, I cannot access any personal information about the individuals that participate. So the question is, okay, what issues arise in trusting an external agency when they say you know, they're anonymizing data for you, okay?
Okay.
Is that something?
You know is that it's owned and operated by Amazon, okay? So automatically there's this level of, do I trust Amazon to have my data? And then the other issue with Mechanical Turk, so you can put a data set into Mechanical Turk, and people, like just random people all over the world, have signed up to work for Amazon to do data analysis via Mechanical Turk, and they are anonymous. So you don't know who's working on your data set, and the volunteers also get paid on some sort of scale by Mechanical Turk. And a lot of data analysis does happen through Mechanical Turk, but I don't know anybody who's actually used it for anything other than transcription.
Oh, okay, well, then let me throw another model.
Yes, would you like the microphone?
Another way that it's being used a lot in psycholinguistics is for, in the simplest case, just judgment studies, where you're basically taking what once would have been a paper questionnaire, where people are just, you know, giving you responses on a Likert scale or some variant, and you can do this online. So that basically what I would upload to Mechanical Turk is the content of a set of questionnaires, okay? And it then puts this out as a what they call a HIT, a human intelligence task, that Amazon workers can do. So, and there are complications. You can insist on certain levels of demonstrated prior competency on the part of the workers. You have to specify how much you're going to pay for the questionnaire they do. So you have control over, you know, the hourly rate on average, because what you're looking at is always a statistic on the average amount of time it took people to do a questionnaire of a certain size, and you can calibrate how much you're paying for it according to that. But then what comes back is just a big Excel sheet. And every worker and that worker's participation on a particular hit has a unique identifier, okay? And the only way you can get back to any personal information is sometimes a worker will make some comment, if you give them a chance, appended to your questionnaire, and you can respond to that worker comment, and if they choose, they can get in touch with you, and then they could reveal personal information. But other than that, you know, the worker lives entirely behind an invisible shield as far as the user is concerned. So, you know, if I want to publish that data, you know, am I covered, or is there any risk in a situation like that? And it seems you could generalize that question too. I mean, because there are other crowdsourcing tools, okay, and if they say they're anonymizing it, can the researcher trust that that's sound?
So I don't know how trustworthy Amazon is in terms of Mechanical Turk. I don't see why that wouldn't be trustworthy, especially, but are you paying Amazon or you're paying the volunteers who do the?
Both, actually.
Okay. So I would think that if you were paying for the service, it would be trustworthy, but I think it would bode investigation first.
Do they get assigned like a unique ID or something for the worker?
Yeah, the worker is assigned a unique ID, so if you see the same worker participating in multiple hits, okay, which is an issue you want to worry about sometimes with respect to psycholinguistic experiments, there'll be a consistent identifier for you for that worker.
So I think if that's, so if you're worried about perhaps Amazon revealing like worker IDs to names, or like, and if you were worried about this and you wanted to add an extra level of anonymization, you could take those IDs, strip them out, and put in like a random string of numbers or letters or whatever. Yeah, re-anon. That's what I did for my data, where people were already using pseudonyms in the online game I was studying, but then I put pseudonyms on their pseudonyms so that they wouldn't, there's like an extra layer. Yeah. So I think that would be one way, if you were worried, if you were concerned about that, just to add an extra. And it would be pretty easy to just do that.
Yeah. I think we need to move on though.
We do need to move on.
More of an IRB issue
Yeah.
than a data management plan issue.
Yes.
And we
Thank
have
you.
10 minutes to do the work session.
Thank you for keeping us on track.
Oh, okay. Well, here, I'll let you talk about the work session.
Well, we talked about the work sessions. Questions are up there. Links are on the slides. We've got some experts on digital language archives here and others. So feel free to investigate. We do have a break after that for 15 minutes. So if you're really going and you don't want to break, please just feel free to hang out and continue to ask questions. But we will restart at 10:15 with the next lecture session. Okay.
All right, everybody. In the interest of staying on time, we are going to start the next session. If you downloaded the slides yesterday, you might want to download them again, because I have modified these slides to add a slide about timelines. Some of the better data management plans that I have read include timelines. I wonder if the batteries are starting to die, because it doesn't feel like it's capturing my voice as well. Let's see. So now we're going to talk about resources, responsibilities, and timeline. And this is sort of the housekeeping section. So responsibilities are really trying to figure out who's going to be responsible for implementing the data management plan, for ensuring that the data management plan is followed and periodically reviewed and revised. Because of course you write this data management plan before you even started the project many times, and you find that what you put in your data management plan maybe doesn't quite work, so it's okay to review that and revise the data management plan. There's no reason not to do that, and that would be a good practice to get into the habit of. We're also going to talk about resources that are required to implement your data management plan, because these resources need to be listed in the data management plan. We've already talked about a lot of these resources over, well, especially yesterday, we talked about a lot of the resources, but now we're going to think in terms of how we put those resources into the data management plan. And finally, you need to think in terms of a timeline. What is the timeline for your project? When is the data being collected during your project? When is data analysis happening? When does archiving the data happen? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so for the rest of this section, I've got these 3 items. This is kind of the lump it all together section, like what's still outstanding to do. I'm going to talk just a little bit about each one of these items, and then we're going to spend 5 minutes brainstorming, or you'll spend 5 minutes brainstorming, then I'll go to the next one, 5 minutes. So it's going to be a lot of focus on me, focus on your work, focus on me, focus on your work for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, so some data management activities include data creation and capture. That's the most obvious thing that you're doing in your project, is you're creating some data, you're collecting some data, you're capturing some data. At the same time, you're also creating or capturing the metadata involved or that describes that data. And at some point, you probably need to do data quality control. And you definitely, as you're creating your data, you want to think in terms of the archival masters versus the working files. So if you've made videos or audio recordings or some other, what's another data type that has an archival master? Photographs. All of these are your large uncompressed files. You're going to save those files somewhere secure, and then you're going to make copies of those files. And maybe the copies, they might be the exact same format, or they might be a compressed version of the file, a smaller version of the file that's going to be easier to work with. And that's what you're going to work with. So you always want to keep your archival master pristine, right? You create it, you copy it, and you don't touch it again. That's your master until you give it to the archive. So the next thing you want to think about is version control. So obviously someone has to be responsible for tracking these versions. So you've got your archival master, you've got your access copy. Now you might do things to that access copy. You might edit video or audio or something like that, and you need a way of tracking the versions that you've created, whether they're spreadsheets or whether they're audio or video recordings. And we talked a lot about version control yesterday and using Git and other programs for version control. So I'm not going to go over that right now. This is just like time to think about what the responsibilities are. You've also got your storage and backup. So again, while you're in the field, in the lab, in the data capture or creation phase, how are you storing and backing up your data? When you're in the data analysis phase, how are you storing and backing up your data? And then when you're in the archiving phase, how are you getting your data to the archive, and what's their plan for storing and long-term preservation of your data? And that leads us into data archiving. And finally, data sharing. So you need to spell out in your data management plan how your data will be shared. So first, again, think about the different stages of the project. Are you sharing your data during the data collection phase, or are you just collecting? If you're in a field environment where a community might be expecting you to share your data as you create it, then that needs to be stated in your data management plan. How are you going to share the analyses? So we all know what dissemination is. We're all expected to give conference presentations and write journal articles, but what other sort of sharing activities will you be involved in? And what's the nature of your project? And your project might have some automatic sharing implications that I don't know about, but you do, okay? So think about what those might be. And then finally, after the project is complete, all your data has been collected, it's all been analyzed, haha, does that ever happen? Do we ever analyze all of our data or feel like it's fully analyzed? No, but at some point your data is going to go into an archive, and you need to think about who's going to have access, who has the rights to this data. We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about copyright and intellectual property. So when the data goes into the archive, who has the right to decide how that data is shared? Right? Is it you? Is it a speaker who is involved in the production of the data? Is it the king of the community where you did your data, or some other sort of community organization? Is it your university? Is it your IRB? Does your IRB specify how you can share this data? And you also need to think about who you're attributing the different parts of the work to. And we talked a lot about that yesterday. All of the people who are involved in the data creation and analysis process, do they need to be acknowledged, or do they have to remain anonymous, right? And to some extent, your IRB will also help you determine the answers to those questions. Okay, so right now, Brainstorm some responsibilities or steps for each of the data management activities from the previous slide, okay? Who will be responsible for each one of those activities for your project, the project that you came here thinking about today or yesterday? So think about that, and then if your project involves a group, if this is a group effort and not a solo linguist effort, how will the responsibilities be split or distributed amongst all the collaborators? Who's responsible for doing what? And the more moving parts your project has, the more defined this section needs to be, because the data is much harder to manage the more people you have touching the data, right? And then think about the data ownership and the responsibilities part of the agreement. So if you were in an environment where you were working with the community, did you set up some sort of memorandum of understanding or contract with that community? And if you did, that needs to be detailed in the data management plan as well. And who's doing what? What are the moving parts? Okay, so spend 5 minutes brainstorming. That's going to go directly into your data management plan. I'm setting a timer. All right, 5 minutes are up, and I hear a lot of lively discussion, and hopefully it's about all of the responsibilities involved in the data management plan. But we are going to move on to some of the resources that you need to think about adding to your data management plan. And so, of course, obvious things are software. What software are you using? Your reviewers will be familiar with your field, and they will know the softwares that people typically use in your field. So you need to make sure that you are using the appropriate software, and if you're using something different, that will have to have been justified in your proposal somewhere. Remember, data management plans are usually limited to 2 pages, so you don't really want to talk a lot here about why you've chosen a particular software. You need to have justified that somewhere in the proposal. Here is where you state specifically the software, the type of format that it will create. If you need any special hardware for your project, you're going to put that in your data management plan as well. And of course, you're going to definitely justify it in your budget justification. Physical storage will need to go into your data management plan because you are going to be storing your data and backing it up every step of the process. And so you need to specify in your data management plan what those steps are, and if possible, name even the devices. Because sometimes if you have named your device, your external hard drive, for example, one of the reviewers might write back and say, oh, I used that and it totally failed, pick another one. So you can get helpful comments back from your reviewers on your data management plan if you've put something in there, if you've named it. You want to name any IT administered storage that you're using, whether it's university-based or cloud-based, because people, again, the reviewers are also using these sorts of storage, and they might know if it's going to be possible or not. They might have some input for you, but definitely name whatever kind of storage you're using. You want to name your data repository. So the archive, or the final home of your data, you need to name that in your data management plan. And it also helps to say that you have contacted the archive and they've supplied a letter of support for you. That's always looked favorably upon in the data management plan, especially if you are applying for the Documenting Endangered Languages grant. And any technical expertise that you're going to need to carry out your data management plan, you need to specify that in the data management plan as well. Because if you don't, and it's obvious that you don't have that expertise, your reviewers will call you out on it. Okay, any questions here? Yes?
Give us an example of the level of detail for naming devices on a university storage, like ScholarWorks, is that the level of detail? Or?
Yes, yeah, you want that. So now ScholarWorks, typically the ScholarWorks, the institutional repositories, they want your analyzed data. They don't necessarily want your raw data. And so you need to talk to the archivist or the librarian in charge of your institutional repository. And again, this will need to go into the data management plan. So if your institutional repository only wants your analyzed product, then you need to state that in the data management plan. If the repository is willing to take raw data, you can say that in your data management plan as well. So you need to be very specific about what's going where.
Besides, like I mentioned ScholarWorks, like one more example of the level of detail.
For the data repository? Yes. Okay. So, for example, Dataverse and Trawling, that we saw the video for them earlier, they are not equipped to handle raw data. So they do not want a lot of video footage of signed languages, for example. What they would want are the data sets, the resulting coded spreadsheets and that sort of thing. That is what they would consider to be a data set. And so you would have to find another place to make your raw video data available if you can even find one. And also you would specify in your data management plan, is it going to be the raw unprocessed data that you're putting into the archive, or is it going to be edited data? As I mentioned before, there is a change happening right now in the data repository world, which is video footage is really, really expensive to preserve and to store. And many data repositories will not take your video. They will take your edited video with your subtitles or your translations or your closed captions or what have you, but they don't want the hours and hours of raw video that you made, especially with your high density camera, because they just don't have the capacity to store it or preserve it for the long term. And so you need to find that out when you're having your conversation with your data repository, okay? Did that answer your question? Yes, okay, yes.
I've acquired gray hair by dealing with a lot of these issues. And one thing I would like to emphasize, stepping back a minute, when you're thinking in terms of the formats that you're going to store that will be available to the rest of the world, think that 50 years ago, 50 years from now, there might not be Excel.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday, yes. Okay. Go ahead, but what's your but? What's your but?
I just want to emphasize that you should look for the formats that are most widely readable by a whole bunch of different kinds of softwares.
Right, exactly.
Which tab delimited is what I would recommend for
yes.
kind of spreadsheet.
Yes.
But the other thing, where you're talking about the storage requirements for video, time is on your side with that. You can hang on to your video, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the ability of servers to store it will be greatly improved.
That is very true, yes.
And therefore, you don't necessarily have to solve that immediately, but you do need to think about what format you're going to eventually store it as. This is something that's in the process of change, so again, you might figure out a way of putting on the shelf, so to speak, for a few years and then coming back to see if the technology has improved.
This is a very good point. So if the archive or the repository says, I'm sorry, I can't take all your raw data right now, we're not equipped to handle it, maybe they will be equipped to handle it in 5 years. Yes.
May I just reinforce that point, being one of the really gray years here, okay? Okay, we all know what these are, right?
Yeah.
The first physical hard drive that I myself laid hands on and took platters out of and so forth. If I wanted to put the same data that's on this device on those machines, I could cover the entire UK campus, okay, and probably most of the rest of Lexington with those 5 megabyte hard drives.
Right.
So I think it's a really, really good point.
Yeah.
Patience may pay off.
Patience, that's right. Now, what goes into your data management plan, you don't want to put in your data management plan, I'll check back with the repository in 5 years, right? That's not going to go over well with the reviewers. So the most important thing to do before you have submitted your proposal to the archive, to the NSF or NEH or whatever the funding agency is you have had a conversation with the archivist or the librarian who's in charge of the repository that is going to house your data, because they can tell you exactly what formats they will accept. And they have to provide you, if you're applying for DEL, they're going to write that letter for you, that support letter saying that they're going to take your data, and you've of course put a big chunk of money in your budget for that archive to take your data. Okay, let's see what I've got next. Okay, so where to seek help, your library, your department or your college, your Office of Sponsored Projects. I'll also add your institutional repository, any archive that you're already aware of that you know is the standard for your field. Go to any of these sources to get advice on what resources are available to you. So I'm the archivist at ILA, the Archive of Indigenous Languages of Latin America, and I can't really tell you what your university offers in terms of IT storage. So you've got to search for that answer at your own university, right? But I can tell you what kind of file formats you can put into the repository that I run. Okay, so now we'll spend another 5 minutes brainstorming the types of resources that you might need for your project. And as you brainstorm them, you need to go ahead and write a justification of why you will need them. That justification might or might not end up in the DMP, or it might or might not end up in the actual budget justification, but you will have to justify what you need and why. And also brainstorm where you'll find these resources. All right, 5 minutes. So if the resource is already a software that you're using, put that in your proposal, in your DMP. Yeah. Okay, 5 minutes goes so fast when we're talking. Does anybody have a question at this point that they want to share with the group? Any questions that didn't get answered just now? Okay. Yes, I'm sorry, Lauren.
We're just sort of about the issue of video being enormous and not wanting to store redundant bits of video, but what if once you've cut it down it's still enormous? Who can you go to?
That you've just hit on one of the biggest issues in data management for our time. We're still kind of in this digital transition age where we're learning how to handle all of our digital technology, and I don't have a good answer to that. Oh, Lauren does. Okay.
So at least at my institution, what we wind up doing is our campus IT department has some large data storage options available, and usually those are for like big university projects, like housing the HR department's information and blah, blah, blah. But many universities have that available for like big data projects, like faculty big data stuff. And they might not have thought of video as big data, but that resource might still be available there. So you might be able to contact a librarian, maybe like a digital scholarship librarian type person, somebody with a title like that who can connect you to somebody over there, or just contact your campus IT directly. And don't be afraid to just call it data. I have data, it's in video format, and it's huge. Do you have any options? Do you have any recommendations? That's what we have had some success with at my university.
Can I add something to that? I also wanted to just say, I talked about this a little bit when I was walking around, that sometimes resources for storage on campus are very happy to have kinds of data that they haven't thought about before, right? So often the institutional repository hasn't thought about the idea of housing data sets, but if you come to them and say, I have some data, they might say, oh yeah, right? Because the more depositors they have, the more they can justify their own existence to the upper administration. So the more people that are using it, the better, number one. Number two, these big data centers like Lauren was talking about might actually be very interested in non-hard science data. So for example, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, they have these huge servers with a lot of sea ice data on it, and that's massive data, right? But the Alaska Native Language Archive also stores their data on that same server because the sea ice people are really thrilled to dedicate what is, for them, a tiny portion of their space to something that is so interesting to them, right? It's an unusual kind of data set for them. So you never know what you're gonna find.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. So then it would be good to specify in a grant that not only would we be using a university-sponsored server for just the raw data, but we should also have the process data in a separate repository for sharing purposes.
Yes, yes. So she said in her DMP, should she specify that the raw data would be stored on this big university computer, but that the edited data would be put into an archive and available for sharing and public access. Yes.
Going back to the previous question, I'd like to re-emphasize that, because huge to us, huge to this, is not really huge in the world of server farms.
Right.
And there are plenty of server farms out there that one way or another are carrying far, far bigger files than anything you could possibly do in a video. So
yes,
there are opportunities. You need to go through IT people and be creative about it.
Yeah, and some of these opportunities you have to pay for. And if it is an opportunity that you have to pay for, then you have to put that in your budget, right? So don't forget to think about long-term storage and putting the long-term storage in your budget. And I will say that some universities that have these super computers or super servers will give every student and faculty member a certain amount of space for free as long as they're affiliated with the university. So, and this might not be something that your department IT knows about, but in theory your library should know about those opportunities that are on your campus and that are free for you as long as you're at the university. And then sometimes after you leave, you might end up having to pay a fee after you leave if you want to keep your data on the really large computer. And again, you just have to investigate that and make sure you've spelled it out in your data management plan and your budget if you're going to have to pay. Okay, so many data management plans now include a timeline. So some of the best ones that I've read have a timeline for managing the data. So you need to contact your archive, first of all, or institutional repository to find out when they can accept your data. Some institutional repositories want you to deposit everything at the very end, and other ones want you to make regular deposits. If you're working on a very long-term grant, like a 3 or 5 year grant, it really is in your best interest to archive periodically during the course of the grant. What happens a lot of times is that people leave the archiving to the very end. They haven't saved enough time for it. And then suddenly they're scrambling to try to get a no-cost extension so that they can get all of their material into the shape it needs to be to put it into the archive. And the archivist has a lot of work. Everybody who works at the archive is very busy, and they can't drop everything that they're doing to help you get your data into the archive, because you're not the only person in that situation, right? And so you need to plan accordingly and build periodic deposits into your timeline. Now, if you're applying for one of the doctoral dissertation research improvement grants, those are typically a year long, but you can get no-cost extensions on those as long as you still have money left in the budget. But you need to take your timeline into consideration at the outset. So when a depositor contacts me saying I'm applying for this 3-year grant, and here's my data management plan, well, I'm going to write them back and I'm going to say, well, your data management plan doesn't include a timeline. So when is your data coming into the archive? And you also need to think not just about the archive, but about spacing things out for yourself, right? So you're collecting data and you're managing the data as you collect it, and then you're analyzing your data and you're analyzing it, you're saving it and storing it and managing it as you analyze it. Or maybe you're doing collection analysis, collection analysis, collection analysis. That timeline needs to be built into the data management plan in some capacity, but especially the part about putting the data into the repository or the archive. Let's see, what did I miss here? I think that we covered everything. So I think it's a good idea when you are collecting raw data, and if the archive will take your raw data, to put the raw data into the archive right away. So we talked about your archival version, the raw version of your data, versus the edited or analyzed version of the data. And some archives will take the raw data up front and put that into the archive, and then later you might want to add edited versions of the data or analyzed versions of the data. So the obvious example is any kind of a lawn transcription. So you've made these recordings. You can go ahead and put the recordings in the archive as soon as you get back from the field, or at least Isla. This is not the same for all archives, so that's why you need to talk to your archivist. But I like it if people put their raw data into the archive as soon as they get back from the field, because it's fresh in their mind. They know what's sensitive and what's not sensitive. And then later, as they make their lawn transcriptions, they can easily add those transcriptions to that resource in the archive. And so they kind of build their collection as they're building their data set. Other archives want everything zipped up together into tight little neat complete bundles at the time that the data gets put into the archive. So this is another reason why it's very important to talk to the archive or the institutional repository at the beginning of your project to find out how they want the data. Okay, any questions? Yes?
What if something changes while you're doing your field work? For instance, you've gotten some raw data, for instance, they've been doing storytelling or something like that, and then suddenly the community decides they don't want that out there. Can you go back in, access, if you've already archived that? pull it out?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So we didn't talk a lot about informed consent yesterday, but typically informed consent is something that you get at the outset and you revisit at every step of the project. And so a speaker could decide at any given moment that they no longer want their voice or their image seen in this archive. So it also falls on you to explain at the outset of the project to anybody involved in the project that by putting the data in an archive, you have essentially published the data and it's out there. So someone might have seen it, someone might be analyzing it, and you can restrict it, but that doesn't mean that it's not already out there in the world. And so it's your responsibility to explain this to the speakers. Many people will then say, then don't put my image in the archive or restrict it from the get-go. And other people will be like, so, I don't care. And so you have to know your community and you have to revisit this issue with the speakers. Now, in terms of archives, so archives, especially digital archives, have processes of long-term preservation. So if Isla, if something were to happen where Isla crashed tomorrow, I could go back to the LTO tape where we've got everything stored and backed up, and I could rebuild the archive. Now, I would have the metadata about this file from 5 years ago. And if you had restricted it the day before the archive crashed, and I didn't have, my snapshot from last night to see that you had restricted the file, then the version that's going to go up is the unrestricted version from 5 years ago. Is this making sense? Okay, so with digital data and the internet, there is no guarantee that something can forever be protected. Does that make sense? Yeah, yes.
You can relatively cheaply get online services like Google Drive that will, for not huge amounts of money, enable you to store huge amounts of stuff. And they take the responsibility for backing it up and so on. And except for Dropbox, which I absolutely recommend against, but Google Drive and probably Microsoft equivalent are good and reliable and worth considering before you ever deposit anything anywhere else.
So we talked about cloud storage yesterday, and we talked a good deal about cloud storage, and some universities allow you to use cloud storage and some universities don't. Many universities will not let anyone touch Google Drive with a 10-foot pole, but I find that Google Drive is incredibly easy to use, but I would never use it as the permanent repository or the only form of storage for any of my field data. As we discussed yesterday, you should have lots of, what does LOCK stand for? Because I don't use that one. Lots of copies keep stuff safe, right? Or the 3-2-1 principle, at least 3 copies on at least 2 different media formats and at least 1 offsite. And so I personally support the use of cloud storage as an offsite media storage and as a form, one of my 2 forms of media storage, but not everybody feels the same way, and certain reviewers will be very opposed to Microsoft and Google and Amazon Web Services. So keep that in mind. You need to know your field and know what your colleagues in your field find acceptable or don't find acceptable. Yes. Any other questions? Because now you're going to build your timeline. So spend 5 minutes thinking about your project and building in the different data management activities that have to happen at different times. Let me get to the correct slide. So the first thing you need to do is think about how long is your project? 1, 2, 3, 5 years. Does the archive have limited times when it will accept data? Like, does it only accept data the first month of every semester or something like that? Think about that. When will you archive your data? And will you archive all of your data at once, or will you do it in phases, once a semester, once a year, only at the end of the project? So that definitely needs to go into the data management plan. Okay, 5 minutes. I had a question that I think would be helpful to everybody, and so I might like start the timer over after this. But when you're creating transcriptions, and your transcriptions will have many versions, I frequently get people who ask me to replace a file in the archive. But because of the description that I just gave about if the archive were to fail and I have to resort to the long-term backups to rebuild the archive, then that earlier version is going to be what gets put back into the archive. And so if you are so sensitive or concerned about your transcriptions that you don't want anybody to see it until it's absolutely perfect, well, first, it's never going to be absolutely perfect in your eyes. And two, wait till the very end of your project to put it into the archive. But many archives will accept versions of that file. And from the perspective of users of the archives, those different versions of your transcription could be very helpful because they can learn about your process of analysis by looking at the different versions. So say you're dealing with a language that has a particular phoneme that behaves very differently in different environments, and you have analyzed it one way in the first pass of your transcription, and then later you decide you've analyzed it wrong in the first pass and you do it differently. So archiving both versions shows the course of your thought and your analysis, and it also will help show that you thought it through. You came to one conclusion, you changed your mind, you came to another conclusion, and it might prevent somebody who reuses your data from coming to the wrong conclusion the first time as well. So many people think by putting different versions in, people are going to think I don't know what I'm doing. Whereas I kind of think of it as by putting many versions in, you're showing how much you've thought about it, right? How much effort you've put into it. Yes, and Lauren.
I did discourse analysis too, and my first pass at the transcript was just a transcript of the words. Second pass had things like pauses, laughs, etc. And some people might find that first version of the transcript more helpful than the second version as well. So each version could also have some different information in it.
Right. Does that answer your question?
Very much.
Good. Okay, so now I'm going to start the timer over.
Just have your attention really quick. It's now 11:15. On the schedule, we have half an hour for discussion scheduled before lunch. And we haven't yet had a chance to look together at the sample data management plans that we've put into the Google Drive. So we'd like to do that in the next couple of minutes. And then a couple of other things to talk about right now is that I just emailed everyone an evaluation form for this workshop. We would very much appreciate if you take the time to fill it out. We hope to offer this workshop at other places in the future, and your feedback will help us make this better. This was the first time we've done it. If you're having trouble filling out the survey in the email, someone had trouble with this, you'll see at the top of the survey there's a link that says, "Are you having trouble?" Fill it out in Google Forms and then just click that link and it should be easier to submit. Okay, so we'd really appreciate it if you take the time to give us your feedback. The other thing is that we're going to start lunch in about half an hour. We all recognize that you all are probably exhausted after 3.5 weeks or 4 weeks of the Institute. So if you need to take the afternoon off and you're not actively working on a data management plan, please feel free to do so. The three of us will be here, so if you are working on a plan and you'd like to start writing it up, we would be more than happy to help you go over it line by line. Whatever you want, we'll be here this afternoon. If you choose not to be, we won't be upset. Nothing like that. It'll be okay. So, do you have a question, Adrian? Okay. So should we take a look at the sample data management plan? Susan put these in there.
So in the Google Drive, the shared class Google Drive, there's a folder that says sample DMPs. And, oh, somebody put their Malawi project DMP in there. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so there's a PDF. Let's start with the PDF. Okay. So this data management plan was submitted to ILA about 4 years ago. And bear in mind that the actual wording of NSF on what they're expecting from a data management plan or the sections that it should have has changed over the years. So this one is from several years ago, but it was so detailed that I asked the principal investigators if I could anonymize it and use it as a sample that I posted on the webpage, and they were delighted, and they said, share it as broadly as you want. And so I've actually put some information in red about what was good about the data management plan. And this one had a very detailed timeline here on page 2. So like half of page 2 is dedicated to their timeline. But this was a senior research grant, so it's a 3-year grant, which is the maximum amount of time that you're allowed to ask of DEL, Documented Endangered Languages. So looking at this DMP, so up here, they've listed the types of data that they're going to collect, and they've also listed their sampling rate. So they've shown what the standards are for their field. And they've explained here in this paragraph how the data will be stored while they're in the field and doing their data collection. Next, they've explained what the final home of the data will be. I can't get this to here. They've said that they've named Isla in the archive, and they've clearly indicated in their data management plan that they have contacted the archive, and the archive has agreed to accept their data. And this is really important because I can't tell you how many times I get calls from reviewers saying, somebody's listed you in their data management plan, and I know for a fact that they didn't contact you. And I'm like, uh-oh. And then I have to hope that the program officer then tells the people, you were supposed to have contacted Isla and gotten a support letter. And typically that does happen. But you do want to let the reviewer know that you have contacted the archive and they're willing to take your data.
You will ingest the data?
Ingest the data, yes. Yes, accession or ingest, yeah. We don't digest it, we just ingest it. Yeah. They have explained how their data will be shared. They will explain how the data can be used by other people. They've explained some temporary access restrictions that they're going to put on the data once it's in the archive. And it's quite common for people to put an embargo on their data for a certain amount of time because they want to be the first ones to analyze that data, right? There might be people out there who are just desperate to know something about some Mayan language, and they will collect any bit of information about every single Mayan language that gets put into an archive. Well, as the researcher who got the grant and did the work, you should get first dibs on analyzing your data. And so you can put a time embargo on your data, depending on the archive. Let's see, they've also specified that they're going to publish under open access because, and there is open access mandate as far as federal funds are concerned, and so they want the data to be as widely accessible to as many communities as possible. Of course, the White House circular that specified open data had U.S. taxpayers in mind, but it turns out that if you're working in a country, in a continent, like anywhere in Latin America, South America, Central America, Africa, parts of Asia, even parts of Eastern Europe, where they might not have access to a lot of the subscription journals that many U.S. libraries have access to, or even if you're a small U.S. institution, you don't have access to some of the big journals because the subscriptions get so expensive that there's now a requirement that you do some publishing in open access formats. And so they've said that in their data management plan. And they've also said that their project is compliant with their university's IRB. And they've included a timeline for putting the data into the archive. Okay, so that one is a good one. Another sample data management plan that I put in here, this one is just in a Google Drive format, and I didn't annotate it. and you can read this on your own. It covers every major topic that we've talked about, except I've put a little suggestion for improvement here to include a timeline for archiving the data. Now, the previous one that I showed you was a senior researcher grant from NSF. This one is for a doctoral dissertation research improvement grant from NSF. So this Thank you. Okay, so the question was, if you have started your project got funded, and you've started your project and you realize that there's something in your data management plan that is not going to work well for your project, how obligated are you to do everything that you said you would do in your data management plan? Is that right? Okay, that's a good summary. So this is always subject to change, and I am not a program officer, and so I cannot answer that question from the perspective of the program officer, but it is quite often the case that you have written a proposal for a particular project, and then you get the money and you start doing the work and you realize that there's something major that you have to change. And if it means, like rearranging budget or moving things around, it is always a good idea to talk to your program officer. So pick up the phone or send an email and talk to your program officer. They would rather you do that than you do something wrong in the eyes of NSF. I know that the Documenting Endangered Languages program officer does check to see if you put your data in the archive that you said you were going to put it in after your grant is over. And if you didn't, that's a strike against you. So if you have to change the archive, the forever home of your data, then you would definitely want to get in touch with the program officer and let them know that you're going to do that and why. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so I think that is the end of our slides, and it is almost lunchtime. We were going to break for lunch at 11:45, and it's 11:30. So as we said before, the after lunch session is going to be a working session and a writing session. And so we're done with the lecture portion, but we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have, and we'll be here to provide any guidance. Just don't hesitate to ask. If you've decided that you have had enough of data management plans for the weekend and you just want to go and relax and enjoy the rest of your Sunday, it was wonderful to meet you. Please do fill out our survey, and please stop by and get our business cards, because we'll be happy to answer questions after today as well. All right, thank you, and we hope to see some of you after lunch.